In this series of demos, I want to get you familiar with the other ways you can provide a source object to your bindings other than using the data context that is the default. First one we're going to look at is relative source bindings. So the starting point for these demos is that we have a solution here with a basic data bound form. It's got a data grid in it. I can fire it up here. And you can see that we have customers from the ZA database that we're using for sample data in this course. The data access is being done through a data layer that's part of the solution. It just has plain old CLR objects for the data entities, and it's got a DB context, an entity framework DB context that we're doing the data access through. Again, how you do your data access is up to you. Just get it into entities and you're ready to data bind. Then we've got the main window code, which is mostly just the contents contain the data grid here with the predefined columns. The data grid is bound to a customer's collection that we're exposing on our data context, and each of the columns is bound to properties on the individual customer object that's being rendered out. As we talked about before, when a data grid renders its rows, it sets the data context for the current row to the current object, which will be a customer in this case, so these bindings on the columns are relative to a single customer. Then we need to set the data context to a collection of customers. And we do that from the code behind. Here you can see we're using our DB context to execute a query on top of the customer's collection, push that into an observable collection that we called customers, and exposed as a dependency property from our code behind, similar to previous demos. Then we set the data context programmatically here by setting data context equals the this reference, the window itself. So the first way we could use relative source bindings is to get rid of this data context equals this here. We can do that declaratively from the XAML. So I'll delete that from the code behind. I'll switch over to the XAML and go up to the top to the window element. And I'll add in a declaration here that sets the data context declaratively through a binding. And remember that binding would normally use the data context as its source object. Well, that's going to get you in kind of a recursive thing here, which isn't going to work. So we need the XAML equivalent here of pointing to the this reference on the window. And we can do that with a relative source self-binding. So relative source is a property on the binding. When set, it's going to obtain an object reference that will be used as the source object. And the way it's going to obtain that reference is through one of several modes that this relative source markup extension supports. This one is the self mode, and it's basically like a this reference on whatever element the binding is on. So in this case, it's going to obtain a reference to the window and set that as the data context, which is exactly what we're looking for here. Now for another example of using a relative source binding, let's say that in our data grid, we want to add a delete button to each row so that we can click on that and delete the corresponding customer. I'm going to drop into my code behind here and go down to the bottom here, and the idea is that we want to have a method that looks like this on delete customer that takes in a customer reference and removes it and possibly deletes it from our database. In this case, I'm just going to remove it from the data bound collection. And we need a way to target that method in a data bound way. Now, a common way to do that would be to use a command object. So I'm going to add in a new dependency property here called delete customer command. Delete customer command is of type relay command of T, and that's a type that's in my solution here. It's a common pattern in data-bound scenarios where you use the iCommand interface of WPF to create an object that can target some other object's method and invoke it when this command object gets executed. Relay command just uses delegates under the covers to point to that method on some other object. The method we're going to be targeting is our delete customer method, and the some other object will be the window itself. So now we need to initialize this delete customer command to an instance of a relay command that points to on delete customer. So I'll just go up here to the constructor of the window and add a line of code that sets that property to an instance of the relay command. And the relay command constructor takes a delegate reference to the target method, which is our on delete customer. So we're just using delegate inference here in C# to pass the method name directly, and it turns it into an action delegate reference that gets passed in as the argument to that relay command. Then basically, if someone executes this command, they'll be executing the target method of that action, which is our on delete customer. So now we just need a way to execute this command, but doing it with data binding from the button within the view. So let's go add that button. To add the button, I'm going to go into the data grid itself and just drop in here and add a new column at the front here. And the kind of column that I added here is a data grid template column. A data grid template column uses a data template, which we'll get into a lot more detail on in a later module, to specify the structure that we want to put into each cell within that column. So you can see we're just putting a button with its content set to delete. So that's what will show on the button. And that'll show up in each row, basically right next to the customer row. Now we need this button to be able to invoke our command or execute that command. So buttons have a command property on them, which we can use to set a binding. And basically we need to be able to point this binding to that command object in our code behind. The challenge is this binding is part of the column definition. And as we saw in other column definitions, the data context for those bindings is a single row object. So these bindings are binding against a single customer, and therefore this binding up here would be pointing to a single customer if we relied on data context. But we don't want to put our delete logic for removing a customer from its parent collection down on the customer object itself. So we need a way to point right here to the window object and to the command object on that window. And one way to do that is with a relative source binding. So what we're going to do is use a relative source to kind of escape from the row and walk our way back out to the window using the relative source. So a relative source lets you walk up the visual tree from where you're at to get to some parent element and then look at properties on it. So now I've fleshed out this binding and I'm setting a relative source property on it like I did with the relative source self binding. But in this case, I'm going to use a different mode of the relative source object, which is to specify an ancestor. An ancestor would be a parent element within the visual tree. And what you can specify is what is the type of that parent element that we want to walk our way up to. So we're down here on a button, inside of a cell, inside of a row, and that eventually walks its way up to the data grid itself and says, yes, that is a type match with the kind of ancestor that we're trying to look for. So that is my source object. Once I get to that source object, I can use any of the exposed properties on that source object to get the data I'm trying to get to with this binding. In this case, we're trying to get to the delete customer command that's part of the window. Well, one way I could have done it is I could have walked all the way up to window here and pointed to delete customer command on that. But just to show another variation, I can just walk my way out to the data grid. Then I know that the data grid's data context is the window itself because that was set earlier on as the overall data context for the view. So then I can dot my way down using property paths to the delete customer command that is on that data context object, which is the window. Now my command is targeting what I want and it can invoke it. Now the other thing is, remember we wanted to pass a customer. Well, objects that support commands also support command parameters. So I can set the command parameter to a binding, and that binding can just use the current data context of the button, which, as I talked about a moment ago, is going to be a customer object, the one we want to delete. So I can just use binding with nothing else on it here, and it's going to grab the whole data context object and pass it as the command parameter. With that code in place, I can start and run. You can see the delete button there, and I can start deleting, and we can see the rows are in fact deleting. So those are the primary forms of relative source bindings you'll use. An ancestor type one to walk up the element tree to find some parent element that's a given type, and then use a path off of that current object to get to where you want to go for a value. The other is a relative source self to effectively get a this reference back to the element that the binding is on to access some other property on that object. In this case, we don't have a path statement, so we're getting a reference to the whole object, the window itself, and setting it as the data context.